Hello everyone, welcome to the first of two webinars where we'll be speaking to a panel of industry experts in relation to the findings of our ESG report, the Sustainability Imperative. We launched this project around 12 months ago to seek to gauge thoughts from the industry as to what the impact of ESG will be and how it will shape the maritime sector moving forward. The clear focus to date has been on the E, and as you know, Watson Farley supported the development of the Poseidon Principles. So we wanted to explore how environmental change may also drive the S and the G and impact all stakeholders. I'd like to say a huge thank you if you were one of the people that completed the survey, and in addition to our panelists and who also agreed, some of them to be interviewees for the report. Your support was really hugely appreciated by us. Today, George Paleokrassas will be moderating the session. And while I'm sure that George doesn't need much introduction, George is the co-sector head of our maritime sector here at Watson Farley & Williams, and he's also head of our Greek office. So just a few housekeeping points. During the webinar today, we will be referring to a few of the stats from our report. You would have received these by email and hopefully you've got the report, but we won't share the slides as we go because I think it detracts from the discussions. If you would like to pose questions for the panelists, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep the questions and we'll moderate them as they come in, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end, about an hour in. The webinar is recorded, but people other than the panelists won't be able to sort of speak or turn their cameras on. But thanks everybody, and George, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you to everyone for joining. I'd like to introduce our panelists to you today, and they are Paulo Almeida, who's the Chief Investment Officer of Tufton Investment Management, Rasmus Bach Nielsen, Global Head of Fuel Decarbonization at Trafigura, Charis Plakantonaki, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Bulk, Georgios Plevrakis, who's the Director of Global Sustainability at the American Bureau of Shipping, and Paul Taylor, who's the Global Head of Shipping and Offshore at Societe Generale. So thank you all for joining us today. In order to get the discussion going, which is based on, as we said, our ESG report titled the Sustainability Imperative, I wanted to pose sort of the first question or the first area of discussion to the panelists, which talks about the drivers for industry change. So it's clear that the industry has to change, and there's an acknowledgement that this has to happen. Survey responses found that there is a big drive. One of the big drivers is regulation and legislation, that the industry is saying this is what needs to sort of create the path and movement to the direction which the industry needs to take. So at the same time, however, the industry is preparing itself for the changes which are coming through voluntary initiatives. So we have the Getting to Zero Coalition, the Poseidon Principles, the Sea Cargoes Charter. There's also, within this context, who takes the lead in terms of leading the change? Is it the IMO? Are there any other bodies? And then considering how these voluntary initiatives and the rules and regulations can work together in order to achieve the change that's being asked of the industry. And finally, just to consider within this overall topic, what influence end users and even the general public may have in this process. So I don't know who would like to kick off the discussion here, and then I'm sure it will start flowing. Charis, please.
Thank you, George, and thank you for inviting me here today. And congratulations to the Watson Farley & Williams team for the great work on putting together the Sustainability Imperative report. Now, with regards to the main driver behind decarbonization in shipping, I would say it is the political will at the global level, which is reflected in the Paris Agreement goals, and despite the fact that shipping is not included in the Paris Agreement. So when it comes to shipping, this commitment is set out in IMO's greenhouse gas strategy to reduce emissions by at least 50% compared to 2008 by 2050. We're also seeing regional legislation coming into play. For example, the European Union is currently developing policy proposals to include shipping in the emissions trading system. And we're also seeing specific countries make commitments to be carbon neutral. For example, Japan and the UK by 2050, China by 2060. As we have seen in the past with other environmental regulations, such as the IMO 2020 sulfur cap, for example, it is actually the regulation, whether at the global, regional, or national level, which ultimately puts the rules into force and which drives the change. Having said that, this does not mean that voluntary industry initiatives, such as the Poseidon Principles and the Sea Cargo Charter, are not playing their part. The pressures from the different constituents across the value chain are actually preparing the ground and are accelerating the pace of industry change. For example, investors who care about the ESG profile of their portfolios, charterers who take a vessel's energy efficiency into consideration in their commercial decisions, and of course, banks which request transparency in the vessel's carbon intensity. Now, all these forces ship owners and managers to improve their energy efficiency and to reduce their overall carbon footprint, always in alignment with the overall IMO greenhouse gas strategy. And it is worth noting that we're also seeing specific companies make commitments. So, for example, Maersk has announced since 2018 that it aims to a carbon neutral fleet by 2050 and also to operate the world's first carbon neutral liner vessel by 2023. And when it comes to taking the lead, shipping is an international industry and its environmental impact cannot be attributed to specific countries. So in that respect, it should be the IMO at the forefront. The IMO is the industry's global regulator, and it is the only organization in a position to enforce global standards. So along with the 2050 strategy, the IMO has also set intermediate 2030 targets for reducing the carbon intensity of the existing fleet by at least 40% by 2030. And the commitment to achieve these goals is already reflected in the IMO's mandatory package of additional technical and operational measures, which will enter into force globally in 2023. Therefore, notwithstanding, of course, the challenges of reaching consensus among the many member states of the IMO, we are seeing actual progress being made.
Thank you very much, Charis. And I saw that Rasmus's hand went up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invite today. I'll immediately, so I'm with Trafigura, and I'll immediately say that not enough progress is being made. Just framing why Trafigura is very active in this space. Trafigura is it's a very large commodity trading house. We trade 5.5 million barrels of oil per day. Second largest metals and mineral trade in the world. We run a fleet of 200 to 300 ships at any given day. We trade carbon, we burn carbon, and we move carbon. Yeah. Today, Trafigura has $60 billion of credit lines. And what is the driver for Trafigura's in-depth engagement in this is we need to decarbonize sooner rather than later in order to be able to run a sustainable business as to what the financiers, the stakeholders, and the employees are requiring. So right now we have a challenge as Trafigura, and I think it's across the whole industry, is we don't have the tools and the encouragement to go out and invest. And when I say invest, it means buying ships or converting ships into the new technology fuels. And two, we don't have the encouragement nor the incentive to go in and off-take on long-term contracts the renewable fuels. So the challenge that we have today, and that's also what led us to bring up this IMO-led shipping decarbonization proposal that we put forward in September last year, we need regulators to step forward, because otherwise the industry, in our view, will not be able to decarbonize to the pace that the world so requires. So what is required? We need things to be done on a global basis. It doesn't mean we cannot support regional measures, because it's helping to push the IMO forward. So in our proposal for this carbon levy, which has received very positive feedback, what we are proposing is that a carbon levy is introduced. There's an establishment of benchmark on all transportation fuels. It's not that many, by the way. It's high sulfur fuel, low sulfur fuel, MGO, LPG, LNG, and it needs to be on a full life cycle assessment basis, including methane slippage. And then, of course, the transport fuels of the future, which we view are being green ammonia and green methanol. And if you establish a benchmark of these transportation fuels, and if you then subsequently penalize charters when chartering ships above the benchmark, and you can create a fund, which we have proposed, and which the charters are to pay, well, then you have funds to subsidize the use of low and zero carbon fuels. So what we believe is that we need a very strong global carbon levy on IMO level, and it needs to be implemented sooner than later. I have a lot more to say, but I will leave the word, and I have much more around this.
I'd just like to chip in there. I mean, I totally agree with the last two last speakers, but we need collaboration quite clearly in the industry. It's not just governance and the regulators stepping in. It's also the voluntary initiatives, that's for sure. I mean, ship owners are charged with going from taking goods from A to B in the cheapest manner. So it's not just down to the ship owners to find the solution. We all need clear governance, and we don't have that at the moment. Clear regulation. Personally, I favour some form of cap and trade system, as it will limit the emissions. But that will set the framework that we can all operate in with confidence. But the voluntary initiatives that you mentioned at the beginning are super key, because it allows us the opportunity of taking the lead. And I've given this analogy before, but it's far better to be in the driver's seat and drive to a known destination at the speed you want to go with, than leap into a vehicle not knowing who the driver is, or how you're going to get driven there, or where you're going to go. So I think you've got to put the regulation and the voluntary initiatives next to each other, and have ecosystem collaboration, because at the moment there's just too much uncertainty, and no one's going to take that first mover risk.
Giorgio, yes.
Thank you, George. And I'll step in just by also thanking you, the organizers, for this lovely panel. I'd like to, in an effort not to echo what my previous co-panelists have also mentioned, I'd like to point out one thing that came up from our study that we did last year on the low carbon shipping outlook that we published. What we have seen, and taking into consideration the IMO ambitions for 2030 and 2050, the ones that Charis has described in her introductory speech earlier, what we see is that our industry, the shipping industry, is probably going to reach its 2050 target for carbon intensity reduction by 70% compared to 2008 values. If we look at the base case where there is a relative gradual and medium to slow adoption of low carbon and carbon neutral fuels until then. But however, the second target for 2050, that 50% reduction of greenhouse gases on an annual basis, that would be even more challenging. And what we have seen is that second target, the latter, can only be achieved if you have an accelerated decarbonization scenario that takes into consideration the entire value chain. It takes into consideration the carbon and decarbonization initiatives that can only happen if you take a value chain approach. So in effect, shipping will not be able to make it alone if you don't have a collaborative, synergetic environment where we actually arrive at that particular decarbonization target in 2050. And the framework, the ambition, of course, is stated by the global regulator, IMO. The instruments, and I want to also to agree with the previous speakers, the instruments and the clarity that is required is not yet there so that we can arrive at those targets. We are discussing different types of fuels. We're discussing carbon neutrality. This has not yet been addressed from a regulatory perspective. So there are gaps that need to be covered in our voyage towards decarbonization in a less carbon intensive future. Hopefully in the next couple of years, as we have all these discussions within the premises of the global regulator, we are going to have this type of framework that can address those issues.
George, if I can just maybe add to what all my co-panelists said. Clearly I agree with nearly everything that they've said. While the additional angle that we can add at Tufton is to talk a little bit about, and we'll do a little bit this later, is the role that investors and institutional investors and pension funds particularly can play in this market, because pension funds are huge stakeholders in decarbonization, because our underlying clients own very diverse portfolios and are, I think, at least as concerned about climate change as governments and consumers, because they have to make sure, one, that their beneficiaries are receiving the cash flows that they've been guaranteed or told they'll be receiving, but also they have to protect the rest of their portfolios. So these are funds that own office buildings, own forest, own farmland, own stakes in insurance companies, and therefore what could be good for one part of the portfolio in terms of, say, mineral extraction can be very bad for another part of the portfolio, because it creates externalities which may make some of the office buildings worth a lot less money because they're in the wrong places, that are either that are negatively impacted one way or another by climate change, or they could have stakes in insurance companies that have a lot of losses due to climate change issues. So we look at decarbonization in shipping, while a lot of the industry thinks of it as a threat. And I think, Rasmus is very right, where a lot of people could think about it as a threat, especially to people who move and trade and to some extent extract energy. But this is really an opportunity to build sustainable businesses. Now, I'm not sure if the right answer is a carbon levy or cap and trade, and that could probably be a debate for a couple of other panels, not this one. But I do think that what's necessary is some sort of economic incentive, and I think one of those systems is likely to be ideal, because you're actually creating an economic incentive for the industry. And this is not just ship owners, but shipyards, suppliers, fuel sellers, et cetera, to create an incentive for people to emit less. And by having that sort of system, although clearly I'm not a complete market purist, but in general, when you let markets and experts and people with money at stake in the business decide what the best solution is, by giving them an incentive to find that solution, that tends to be how you get a good outcome. So I'm not saying we disagree with regulation, like WEXI, for example. These are positive and they sort of send messages to the industry. But I do think also that we need an instrument that's less blunt, and one that actually creates direct incentives to find solutions, rather than just to encourage basic compliance.
Thank you very much, Paulo, and to everyone on the comments they've given so far. I see Charis has her hand up, and if I can just add one point before we carry on. I mean, you've very clearly framed the discussion. It's clear at the moment that everyone, one word I think which came out quite a bit in the initial responses was a lack of clarity, or that it sounds as though we're at the beginning of a process. The question is how that process can be accelerated, and how clearly, again, there seems to be a consensus that the IMO needs to do this. The IMO is a body that isn't known to move with a great deal of speed, not just because of the nature of the body, not the IMO itself. IMO and similar bodies don't move as quickly. And then the other element I wanted to add in, because there was a reference also to collaboration, and also Georgios said collaboration across the value chain as well. How that's achieved in an industry which is on its own fragmented, so within itself, let alone taking into account of other stakeholders who could be seen as part of the industry, but sometimes are seen outside. So I'll just allow Charis to go, and then I know that Rasmus wants to speak as well.
Thank you, George. So I would like to second the comments of my fellow panelists with regards to the need for partnerships and initiatives, as well as the need for policy making, and to elaborate a bit more on that. So obviously, to meet the IMO's long-term objectives, the industry will need to see zero-emission fuels come into the picture. And given the multifaceted nature of the industry, this cannot be made unilaterally. Therefore, partnerships or JVs among different constituents will be necessary in order to share the risk of early adoption technologies. And the constituents such as fuel producers, engine manufacturers, ship owners, charterers should get together to achieve that. From a recent mapping of zero-emission pilot projects that the Getting to Zero Coalition undertook, we see that more than 100 projects have already been identified globally, which focus on zero-emission pathways for the maritime industry. Now, who are the best placed to take the lead here? In my view, it should be the large players within each step of the value chain, so the ones who have the availability of resources and the networks in place. One recent example is the Castor initiative, which was announced recently and which plans to design and build the world's first ammonia fuel tanker by 2025. This is a partnership of major players like Yara, the Singapore MPA, MIN, Samsung, MISC, and others. Now, at the same time, initiatives such as the Getting to Zero Coalition that we have made reference to, but also the Maersk McKinney Moller Center, where different sectors like maritime, energy, infrastructure, government, finance join forces, are indispensable fora to consolidate and share latest developments and research, but also to create synergies among constituents and accelerate the development and implementation of new energy projects. And it's very important that such partnerships are also crucial to ensure that first mover projects do not only stay at the level of test cases or pilots, but are thereafter also scaled up. So for example, it will be crucial for these partnerships to engage with governments so as to support the scaling of such initiatives. And let's not forget that decarbonization of our industry is only one part of, part of the broader energy transition globally. Therefore, for companies to take a leap of faith and make investments, we would need to see the necessary policy action. And this is where alliances can help in engaging with governments and policymakers on the regulatory support that will be needed.
Thank you, Charis. Rasmus, I can see you want to jump.
Yes, we totally, of course, agree that partnerships are required. However, one cannot be sort of underestimating that if you are to bring a hydrogen-based fuels, which is by far the lowest emission fuels, there is a very, very significant price difference as these assets are to hit the water. And we know that engine technology is ready by Q4 24. MAN have publicly stated that. Today, on a 10-year forward offtake, for someone to take that, and it's important to sort of frame it and get the realism right. 10-year offtake for green ammonia right now is around 500 euros per ton. It probably will become low over time as technology improves, etc. The calorific value is 2.2 times less than regular fuels. Yeah, so you have to burn two times as much fuel versus the fuels that you have today. No one today, more or less without exception, is capable justifying paying for that fuel today, more or less regardless how green you want to be as a company. Yeah, it's very important to understand that if you don't have the appropriate regulatory framework, it will be very, very, very hard for the shipping industry to push the change forward. Yeah, and I give you a challenge that I give you. So for Trafigura, we have not been able to set a task for our Scope 3 emissions, and we've said we will only do it by 2023 because we believe the current technology within the industry today is not sufficient for us to set aggressive enough targets that our financing banks are requiring. Yeah, it's great that there's efficiency improvements for current fleet. Of course, that is tremendous. Yeah, so we can only say we totally support that. But in order how fast the world is moving and has moved, particularly in the last 12 months, the current technology is just not good enough to satisfy stakeholders in 3 to 5 years. And obviously, we know that the pace within IMO is very, very slow. And here, and I'm spending a lot, and Trafigura is spending a lot of time, and me personally, with IMO member states, with NGOs, various panels, World Economic Forum, Getting to Zero, Global Maritime Forum, etc. I must say, right now, I'm not sure that the industry bodies that we have in shipping are pushing IMO hard enough. Yeah, I challenge that also from various conversations to give IMO the mandate that the shipping industry needs IMO to pick up. Yeah, it's very dangerous because right now you have regional measures, you have EU ETS, which we don't know how it's going to look. You have Secretary John Kerry. Obviously, there's a green transition happening in the States. He's also talking about regional measures now. So the challenge is, and this is a huge risk for the shipping industry if it does not pick this up immediately, that we will get regional regulations around the world, and yet again, will ship owners be stuck with the bill? And then the shipping industry has to realize, is this really the desired outcome? You look at ballast water treatment systems, you look at scrubbers, ship owners are not capable of passing the bill on. So if regulation, if the shipping industry does not get together and push things forward on a global IMO-led level, more or less immediately, well, chances are that the ball will get dropped yet once again, and the charters will not be able to come and save it. Whereas now, if you get regulation, you can actually put the cost and the burden of paying higher transportation costs when chartering higher emission ships on the charters. But if we get regional regulation across the world, it will be very difficult to implement the system. So I can only encourage and embrace that the ICSs, the Intertankers, the BIMCOs, etc., get to speak to their members and understand, well, how important is it that we get a position forward to the IMO, so we give them the mandate for the industry to transform. I say one last comment, and I know I speak a lot, and I could speak a lot. IMO member delegates, looking at the past of IMO, they have market-based measures proposed in 2013 and 2014. Today, within the IMO, a lot of member states are satisfied with the $2 IMRB proposal that's there right now. That goes into R&D. That will be a total drop in the ocean, and it will not drive behavioral change from anyone. So if we get this for the next 3 to 5 years, potentially the whole industry becomes even more uninvestable. So we have an identity crisis, I would say, that we need to solve very quickly. And I'm very hopeful that it can happen.
I do think, Rasmus, you're right, that the industry groups need to lobby the IMO. I mean, it has to come from the IMO ultimately. It's the certainty of regulation that we all need. There's this there's this way in shipping that over the decades that ship owners have all worked for themselves. It's the crude way to say the dog-eat-dog approach. What's in it for me? And right now, everyone's got to work together and find what is right for the common good. This is way outside the word of competition. This is where all ship owners, all parties within the whole ecosystem of shipping need to work together to find what is right for the industry. And I think what holds this whole process back and the momentum back, even though there is momentum, is that people, the ship owners, tend to be very much looking from within about how they themselves should act. And going forward, we need a much more of a team effort, if I may call it that. And just look at the Poseidon principles, for example, the value of coalition. You've got here several more banks have joined in the last few weeks. We've got way over 20 banks now, a few more to follow in the next coming weeks. It just shows the power of having capital providers all doing and saying the same thing. You're much stronger together than you are separately. And I think at the moment, there's too many individual parts moving in different directions. But still, ultimately, it's the IMO that needs to take the lead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. For your thoughts and very clear and strong thoughts in that respect. But just sticking on that point of collaboration, how, I mean, and I know, Paul, you just explained, in terms of the benefits of alliances and how that can drive behavior. And while it's clear that everyone, and the reasons for saying this are clear as to why the IMO needs to take the lead, needs to set the regulations so that we avoid a situation where we've got multiple and competing regional regulations. What does the industry do in the interim? How can it bridge this gap, or let's say deal with that interim period until we get clear and overriding regulations that apply to everyone? What can the industry participants do to influence behavior, for example, and to reward first movers? Rasmus?
Like the Poseidon principles, through Global Maritime Forum, they've also initiated the Sea Cargo Charter. And it's along the same principles as Poseidon principles. It's independent reporting of CO2 emissions. Also, it has received very positive, it has had very positive receipts since October last year. It's going to grow a lot. So what it is, it's independent reporting of CO2 emissions after completion of, or for companies on annual basis. What that does, it puts also the charters sort of on the hook on accountability. It helps sort of create a frame in terms of what are emissions. So the industry can help itself through growing these standardization initiatives, such as the Poseidon principles, as such as the Sea Cargo Charter. When these things are in place, and it's a journey that has just begun. The Poseidon principles started, I believe, 18 months ahead of the Sea Cargo Charter, and it's really well done also by Paul, who was part of that group with Michael Parker and others from Citibank. As you have this alignment of reporting, then we suddenly have something where we can compare apples and apples, and then people, including, I mean, the charters, will become more accountable for the ships that we charter. And that could be drive an indirect behavioral change. But the real behavioral change only comes when we have the government legislation and carbon levies, in our view, that can encourage the use of low and zero carbon fuels. But my answer is standardization of calculation of emissions is a starting tool.
Yes, please.
Can I expand a bit on that? Yes, I think that we have now identified that we are up against an emerging landscape, as we tend to call it in our presentations in ABS. It's an emerging landscape of either requirements or policies or initiatives that drive decarbonization. And in that landscape, you do have the regulatory part as well as the market initiatives that were mentioned earlier. This is something that I'd like to emphasize because it is something that needs to be strategized by ship operators and ship owners. This creates a framework of information, of data, of reporting calculations that need to be considered when one is actually performing or drafting a company strategy. And we do have some short, mid, and long-term perspective in this strategy. Taking, for example, the metrics that were inferred by my co-panelists earlier, you have different metrics to calculate, for example, the carbon intensity of the assets that we are interested in. You have a metric that takes into consideration, for example, actual cargo carried. You have another metric that takes into consideration the deadweight of the ship. IMO is now considering which one of the two metrics is going to be using in its calculation for the compliance against the adopted trajectory called the CII trajectory, the carbon intensity trajectory that will take us to 2030. Now, I will go back to an initial comment. I think it was your comment, George, when you said that these things create either challenges or opportunities. If one start to consider all these things in the planning ahead, then one could also implement this type of metrics and KPIs in its business strategy. So we have already seen this being put in practice by a number of companies on how they can strategize their moves in order to gain competitive advantage. How you can actually go from a decarbonization strategy to a business plan by incorporating all those aspects. And of course, this has many elements. This has not only technical elements on how you design ships, how you expect the chartering to be done, also how you expect the financing to be done. These are a lot of things that need to be incorporated in that type of strategy.
Well, thank you very much. And Charis wants to add something now.
Yes, I would like to comment on the reporting requirements by different stakeholders towards shipping companies. We are a listed company, and shipping companies like ourselves who look to attract investors, back financing, first-class charterers. We have no option but to improve on our transparency, our reporting, corporate governance, and of course our overall performance. And both investors and financiers are increasingly interested in the ESG profile of their counterparties. And as Rasmus has also said, they are actually walking the talk by using it as a decision-making criterion. Starbucks, for example, publishes an annual sustainability report where we lay out our ESG strategy and goals, and we report on our ESG performance across all our activities. And we are seeing our counterparties being increasingly interested in that. So this is a sign that notwithstanding the absence of specific targets, for example, on the S and G front, there are targets on the E front, but there aren't targets on the S and G. Pressures from industry participants are driving the change. But I do want to comment here on the fact that we see as a barrier on this front the fact that there is a lack of industry-wide standardization on ESG, and that each constituent or even each company within a certain stakeholder group has their own requirements. On top of that, there are also different independent ESG ratings in the market, which makes things even more complicated for a shipping company. So this at times is time consuming, it's confusing. So as a suggestion to the different industry stakeholders, and in order to accelerate progress also on governance and transparency, I would suggest that clear and consistent guidelines should be developed and adopted across the value chain. Thank you.
Sorry if I may say, I mean, that is an interesting thought. It would certainly help. But if I can just apply what's happening in the banking world to this discussion, that's highly unlikely to happen. You might get some form of similarity in terms of process that's required on transparency, in terms of governance, but actually having every bank aligned in what they require doesn't seem to be the case. Everyone has their slightly different requirements. I mean, there's no doubt that going forwards, the focus has been and still is rightly on the E, but the S and the G, which have been not completely disregarded or overlooked, but the emphasis hasn't been large enough on that is going to become absolutely key moving forwards. And it's going to be just like climate alignment has become now a key part of the credit process for banks. We're going to have the S and the G as well. So how companies go about scrapping their vessels, crew welfare, their transparency levels that Charis is talking about, the whole corporate values of the clients is going to become absolutely key to as part of the decision-making process for the capital providers. Having, though, a standard set for each provider, I just don't see that materializing, unfortunately.
Thank you, Paul. Paulo.
Yeah, I agree with what Paul was saying about, you know, the S and G. I think for some reasons being a little bit less of a priority, or apparently a little bit less of a priority in the shipping industry for the past few years. However, although it's come about from a crisis, I think that crew welfare is due to the problems that we had in changing exchanges of crews and relieving crews last year due to COVID lockdowns. I think that has brought to the forefront, unfortunately, due to sad circumstances as opposed to happy circumstances, that, you know, crew welfare is something that's very important. That's probably overlooked by maybe the bottom quarter of the industry. And, you know, we have seen leaders, obviously we report on this in our public, we have a public company, we have 3 or 4 very large private funds. We report on this privately in our private funds to our clients who are very concerned about this. And then publicly, we also disclose regarding our public company. And we've seen shipping actually be in the mainstream press in the past 15 months, probably more than it has been since double hulls. So I remember we all know Patty Rogers. Patty Rogers used to joke about what are people going to talk about in 2020, because we won't, and Bob Burke used to say the same thing. We're not going to have scrubbers to talk about. Well, what will we have to talk about? Well, we've now had to talk about the crew rotation crisis, which is obviously a sad circumstance. But we also had floating storage, and then we had the state of the current container market, all in the mainstream press. I think all of this is very good for shipping. Of course, as I said, for the crew reasons, sad circumstances. Anything that brings to the mainstream financiers. So I'm not talking about shipping specific financiers or shipping specific investors like Tufton, but you had Fidelity, which is one of the 3 biggest global money managers, publicly writing letters to its investee companies about the crew crisis. So I think anything that gets shipping into the mainstream press is helpful. I think it will also help. We all agree that the environmental decarbonization is very important, but I think it'll also help find solutions for some of the S and the G. But I think we should all welcome this publicity, even if some of it initially was bad publicity, like about the crew rotations. The industry needs to stop hiding. I think it's the same thing that Rasmus and Paul and others were saying, that the industry shouldn't shirk from publicity, shouldn't shirk from responsibility and regulation, and should go on take a forward step to find the regulatory framework or economic incentives that actually help decarbonization.
Okay, thank Thank you very much, Paulo. And I like the statement that the industry should not be hiding. So that is an important consideration. And I think it is reflected, to be honest, in a lot of what's been discussed already, that in terms of the need to be proactive, the need to take the lead, and also this has to be aligned with rewards as well. So it's not a case of taking the lead for no other purpose. But since we've moved on, the discussion has moved on into the S and the G, and it's important that we do cover this as well. I mean, our survey results showed that the majority of the financiers who participated in the survey said that they're going to be introducing their own governance criteria and requirements for their customers over the next 12 months. So the majority are saying that new rules are coming in which will apply to their customers. Now, where we saw a disparity, which exists far less on the E side, where there is much closer alignment between owner operators and financiers on what needs to be done, on the initiatives which need to be taken. What we did see, however, is that when it came to owner operators, that really a large majority, 61%, say they're not looking to change any element of their governance structure at this time. Although, in terms of the drivers for change, number one, unsurprisingly, is regulation, and then in terms of pressure from financiers or consumers. So when we listen to this, what are your thoughts in terms of how much the participants here? So we have a major charterer, we have a major banker, and in terms of the other industry participants, what steps can you take to actually influence a change in the S and the G as well at this time?
Sorry, I don't hear you asking the question too, but I'll go first. It goes back to what I was saying earlier on about, I was mentioning about coalition, but in terms of being a provider of capital, and if all the major financiers are, and it's been gradual since the financial crisis, the corporate values have got much stronger, and this has led to stronger corporate governance. And I think all serious lenders are requiring more. So as providers of capital, that is going to have a degree of influence on our clients in terms of what we require if we are able to allocate our capital to the shipping industry and to our clients within it. So I think there is going to be greater pressure from the financial community on transparency. And apologies for repeating myself, but I think going forwards, we just we'll need to ask more questions in the KYC process, and everyone will groan because it's already quite long. But we'll have to ask more questions, to know everything about the company and the reason behind the flagging, the beneficial owners. These are things we do already, and that's normal. The good news is that we shouldn't be painting this picture as if there's this huge shift requirement. There isn't. The clients we're dealing with, and we focused on what we say they call it the top tier clients. Most of these clients now have very transparent sustainability reports. They are moving the direction the whole industry is moving in anyway, which is to transparently disclose carbon emissions. So that's the E. That's going to become part of the course going forwards. And there's going to be a shift change, I think, also in the S and the G, which is built on sustainability, responsibility, transparency, and discipline. And Rome wasn't built in a day, but step by step, I do believe we're getting there. But it's parties like the capital providers which will put a great deal of pressure on this to happen.
Yes, thank you, Paul.
I just wanted to add a little bit to what Paul said. So, you know, we're a capital provider to the industry as well, of course, a little bit differently from Paul as a debt financier. So, you know, whereas the debt financiers can encourage their existing clients to improve or slightly discriminate. I'm sorry, Paul, if maybe you don't, if you object to that word, but sort of to some extent positively discriminate towards the better people to make it more expensive for the people that they want to see improve. So that's an incentive that the debt financiers can do. Whereas, you know, we actually are, although we don't think of ourselves as a ship owner, we're a financial investor. We can own whatever type of ship we want to, or none at all, from time to time. So what we try to do is to help establish best practice, so that through our disclosures, we can then work with the best charterers, you know, maybe like Trafigura, like Maersk, like others, just to name two, and they both happen to be Danish, I guess. Or at least the Danish guys run Trafigura shipping, as opposed to Trafigura being a Danish company. But in that way, then when Tufton goes from having 0 to 10 ships over the course of 5 years with one of these big charterers, and some of the traditional ship owners say, hey, Mr. Maersk, you know, I used to have 6 ships with you on time charter 5 years ago. Now I only have 2. These guys at Tufton, who I never heard of, or hadn't heard of five years ago, now have 10 ships on charter to you. You know, am I doing something wrong? And Maersk may say, well, you know, Tufton has very excellent policies regarding operation of ships and also transparency. So, you know, we all make mistakes from time to time. We all have bad things that happen somewhere in the value chain, and therefore sharing information on those bad things that happen from time to time so that they can be avoided in the future, and also sharing information on how we can all decarbonize or help solve the crew situations, you know, is something that's very important. So we think knowledge sharing and increasing transparency is something that can help the industry overall. So we're trying to set as good an example as possible.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Paulo and Rasmus.
A comment on ESG and the importance and value of this for the charters and for the owners, but for the owners, I think, and it's great actually, ESG is becoming a competitive parameter. So the owners who understands the emissions, and particularly emissions, because obviously that has today the highest value in ESG, I think, because it's such a world issue, yeah. But those owners who manage to get ESG right will be able to present a value added compared to the competitor who doesn't. And I think that by itself is a positive change from what we've seen in the past. So that will indirectly create change. Yeah. So that's just to frame it around what you say, Paul. There's different requirements. So the ESG, those who master that will have an equal importance on the ESG department compared to the chartering department, I think. Yeah, it's changing. Times are changing, but for the better, because society requirements are changing, and when we all part of this in terms of the industry as such. And you talk about it, Georgios. I can only agree that there is a historical challenge, yeah, for the industry. And now I talk regulation and carbon levy and decarbonization in its whole context. It's also a historical responsibility for the industry to step up, not to make mistakes of the past where you let a bureaucratic place, which IMO is, decide for the industry. Now the industry, I think, needs to push and take responsibility, push up. What do we want and what do we need? And also to make sure it happens. So historical responsibility. And at the same time, I also think it's a historical opportunity, because we've never been in the same transformational space that we are today, where requirements have changed so fast. And we're very privileged, generally speaking, as an industry, because technology is ready to provide the zero low carbon fuels, whether it's green methanol or green ammonia. And the investors also, fortunately enough for the industry, the investors are so ready. Yeah. So I think there's many aspects that talks around a very positive opportunity for the industry, but the industry really needs to understand and take it up.
Sorry, Julia, I mean, I think the investors are ready. Sorry, apologies, Georgios. I think the investors are very ready. They have the money to invest, but what they also need is the green label given to them by the authorities, by the EU taxonomy, by the CBI, by anyone else, in order to invest, because they have a choice. They have a choice of industries, and it's not just the profitability of the shipping industry; it's the ESG as well. So this green label that we require as an industry should not be underestimated, because if only a few transactions achieve that, it's going to actually detract the investors and put the energy transition back at a time when the industry needs the investment most. Sorry, Georgios.
Thank you both for those.
No, actually. Yes, thank you, Paul. Actually, I was gonna have say a couple of comments along those lines, and I will share personal experience. All this discussion and all these elements of discussion that we are addressing today, if you look a couple of years ago, they were considered a bit exotic, to be honest with you. Now what we see is that it becomes a bit, cannot call them mainstream, but it is becoming part of our mainstream discussion. I would actually, taking the opportunity of Paul's last comment, I would say that we have, if you look at the fact that we have 2 or 3 meetings every week addressing the fact and the necessity of SPO support, then that actually shows that there is some sort of an interest arising or developing around those lines, around the green labeling and the ESG approach. The other aspect that I wanted to touch upon was how do you begin to standardize that? Because we did mention that the biggest focus, of course, is on decarbonization. And again, going back a couple of months ago, if you said, if you mentioned the word sustainability in our industry, the biggest majority will actually think about decarbonization. But sustainability is not just about decarbonization. There are more colors in that rainbow to infer the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were put forth several years ago in the Paris Agreement, and now we have it also kind of being adopted by IMO. Now, how do you create this sort of standardization? I would agree with the previous speakers, that needs to happen. We don't have a standardized approach. However, you can start from some point, being a bit more technical. We started at identifying how certain SDGs can be reflected on how you design it, to also incorporate the human element and how you can actually structure the notion of habitability around vessels in new designs, taking the other elements, of course, aside, the elements that are related to decarbonization, increased efficiency, low carbon fuels, and so on. So I think that while there is a big focus on the decarbonization aspect of the sustainability rainbow, we also see movement towards the other aspects, the other colors of that rainbow, as far as new projects are concerned and discussions.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Well, we'll just wrap up, because we're, it seems incredible, but we're coming up to the hour mark. So because the discussion has flowed very well, and the time has flown by. But just one last question to all of you, which hopefully we'll just keep brief. But our survey showed that there was a huge difference in the importance which different industry participants attach to ESG as a whole, not just the E element, with 29% of owners saying that ESG barely influences their investment decisions at this point, as against 90% of financiers saying it has some or critical importance. So with that background in mind, how confident are you that the industry will meet the ESG targets over the next decade? And if you have some ideas about what the major barriers to achieving that might be. We'll start with Charis, and then we'll quickly go through everyone.
Thank you, George. So I will focus mostly on the E, because this is where we do have specific targets as an industry versus S&G. There is an absence of clear targets. So on the environmental front, the next decade, we will be seeing a lot of progress on the technical and operational efficiency of the existing fleet, whether in the form of energy-saving devices, retrofits, hull painting or cleaning, voyage optimization technology. These are all necessary to meet the IMO 2030 goals and to ensure the tradability of our vessels. And a lot of these solutions already exist, while at the same time we see new technologies entering the market at a fast pace. Less efficient vessels may be forced to slow steam or even to be scrapped, and ship owners should definitely start planning in advance on how to accurately monitor and improve the carbon footprint of their existing fleet as soon as the IMO targets are set in stone in the upcoming MEPC. So judging from the availability of solutions and the prompt activation of the industry, I'm confident we will be meeting this specific ambition. Now, the barriers we mostly see with regards to the long-term IMO targets, which, as we have already discussed, will require the use of zero-emission fuels. So in the coming decades, we should be seeing technologies mature and policies frameworks being established before zero-emission vessels and fuels can be scaled up. As a ship owner, we are concerned with the technical and safety-related aspects that need to be in place before adopting new fuels and engine technologies on a vessel. So, for example, methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, although they are already being transported by ships, they are either more flammable or more toxic than heavy fuel oil. Of course, another major barrier for a shipping company is related to the economic viability of investing in new vessels or retrofitting existing vessels. As we have already mentioned, the cost differential between zero-emission fuels and existing fuels is estimated to be very high, and ship owners will be reluctant to invest in new technologies and to buy fuel at significant premium without assurance that there is a market that will be willing to pay for the additional cost. So just as a final note, in order to overcome these obstacles and to enable first movers, financial institutions will need to provide funding for the projects, but also governments may finance investments in zero-emission vessels and vessel retrofits, for example, through direct grants or concessional loans. And thereafter, de-risking of any ship investment is important, for instance, through long-term charter contracts between ship owners and cargo owners that could pay a premium for green shipping and could then pass on the increased fuel cost to the end consumer. It is estimated that the potential cost to the end consumer of a shift to green shipping will be relatively low, given that freight costs are a very small portion of consumer good prices. Very final comment, policymakers can further facilitate such charter agreements by creating the policy mechanisms and economic incentives to bridge the cost gap between zero-emission fuels and existing fuels, as it has already been discussed with our panelists. For example, by subsidizing zero-emission fuels and bringing down fuel costs for the ship operators. Thank you.
Thank you, Charis. We also have, I see, questions coming in from the audience, and I don't want to, I want to allow some time for that. So just very quickly, if we could wrap up this section, and I can see Rasmus.
Yes. And I'll make it very brief. So in terms of targets, we don't think the current targets are good enough, IMO targets, compared to what the stakeholders globally, financiers, stakeholders generally speaking, are requiring. The current target does not suffice to what the world is demanding. Yeah, that's number one. So targets for us has to be much more aggressive. Two, barriers, global regulation, market-based measures is a requirement in order to facilitate and encourage the use of low and zero carbon fuels.
Thank you. Right. I'll hand over to Lindsay now, who's got some questions from the audience.
Hi, yeah, so thanks everyone for the questions that have been coming in. Rasmus, maybe first one was for you. Who would you see as being responsible for paying the carbon levy? Would it be the person paying for the bunkers?
It's a very good question, and it's one of these things that has to be figured out as you get deeper into the problem. We believe the charters are well positioned to be forced to pay the bill. And why the charters? Because it will drive behavioral change, how the charters select ships in the process. So we would support charters being accountable.
Yeah. Charis, maybe a question that I'll paraphrase for you. There's a comment that the IMO targets do not reflect real life, and the goals do not reflect the challenges which shipping companies face, and long-term planning for long life assets and making the leap. So it comes down to this first mover challenge. How do you decide when to make the leap and make an investment decision? What would you say to a ship owner that's worried about making the long-term investment with uncertain regulation? Charis, maybe that's one for you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay. So as we have already covered, the technology readiness is not there yet. Therefore, ship owners at the moment have this specific barrier in order to place new orders. And in that respect, we also expect that there will be a reduction in the ordering of new vessels, exactly because there is the uncertainty of what will be the fuel of the future and to what extent any investment right now makes sense for the long run. Therefore, at the moment, it is expected that there will be reluctance on behalf of ship owners to place orders for new vessels. And the focus will mostly be on improving the technical and operational efficiency of the existing vessels, but also as soon as the IMO targets are set in stone, ship owners should be making a long-term strategic plan of which vessels they should be disposing of and at which point in time in order for them to be compliant and be able to trade them. So we expect that new orders will pick up only in a few years from now when there is more clarity and certainty on which technologies and which new fuels are the most prominent ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Paulo, this is one for you, referencing the EU taxonomy. I suppose, isn't that seen already as a move in the right direction and trying to get standardization across the board, as it will impact all sort of financiers and listed companies? I suppose we all see that, but one question I'd put to you is how do we ensure that the EU taxonomy and the developing regulation will be fit for purpose?
Did you say Paul or Paulo?
Paulo, sorry.
Well, Paul, did you say you wanted to discuss? No. I thought you.
I don't mind.
Someone in the panel specifically mentioned.
It was Paul. It was
okay.
Paul.
I'm happy to answer the question. I think the EU taxonomy is important. Why? Because we need a green label. We need a definition of what is green, because that's going to drive investment in the industry. So yes, it needs to be standardized. We have to have a very, very clear understanding of which investments in new vessels are going to achieve a green status and which are not, and also on existing vessels which might achieve a green status for refinancing, because this will drive the investment in the industry that it so desperately needs. So, it's got to be standardized, and all the different certifications that we have in this industry need to be aligned so that everyone can move forward in a very, very clear direction.
Here's a quite a good question. I don't know who would want to answer it, but in the interest of transparency, should owners and charterers publish their full carbon accounting and absolute emission volumes and not just the percentage cuts and efficiency index levels? Rasmus, thought you may want to answer that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, the Sea Cargo Charter created by the Global Maritime Forum, which has the same principles as the Poseidon Principles, which is very much about accountability and transparency. the Sea Cargo Charter does exactly this. Yeah. So the signatories who sign up for the Sea Cargo Charter, they also sign up for global transparency. So yes, very much believe in this, and it will only, this is where the industry is going on transparency.
Jorgo, maybe a question for you on the class society. So what do you think the role of class society should be supporting ship owners developing their ESG strategies?
Well, I wish I had more time, because that's a part of normal workshops that we do. Well, of course, we start with the decarbonization aspect, because because of the fact that decarbonization is the biggest, and I would dare say it is the biggest challenge of our generation. And I think that it was pointed out many times during this panel discussion that we are at a turning point. It is a challenge, but also an opportunity. That's where we start from. And because as far as shipping is concerned, we tend to believe that we have domain expertise, particularly on the technical aspects of the decarbonization aspect. We believe that a classification society can actually prove itself very, very valuable in assessing, first of all, what kind of metrics we should be using when we are doing that sort of analysis, how we structure our KPIs with regards to that aspect, and then how we can actually expand to the other parts of E, and then S and G. And of course, it will be a very E-heavy approach, but at this point in time, that's what also the industry is looking for.
Thank you. We are getting some very interesting questions coming in, but I'm conscious that I don't want to outstay your welcome and the time of the panelists that they've given us today. So I think I like one suggestion of a global KYC database, which I'm sure all ship owners would love, Paul, and it would make bankers' lives easier too. But maybe that's next year's project potentially. And
well, I'd just say, Lindsay, that it's a good question. It's a question that's been asked before. It's a great idea. I think all bankers would embrace it. But if there's someone out there who wants to take the reins, great idea.
But I think there's interesting themes coming through as well about the role of ECAs and what ECAs can play, and I think that goes to one of the findings from our survey about the role of governments in this, and it's much wider than just shipping. It's the infrastructure, it's the port. So there's some really good themes coming through. We'll take a note of the other questions and try and get back to people where they were a bit more specific. But I'd like to thank George for moderating. I'd like to thank all of you today for joining us and taking your time out of your day. So thanks from me.
Yes, thank you very much from me. It was a very interesting debate. I hope that, and that's reflected in the questions, I think, because, it's not usual that we get that level of questions, but after these sessions, but that was, I enjoyed it very much, and I hope you did as well. And we all thank you for your time in participating, and also to everyone who listened in as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.